And let's just dive right in. David Gergen, thank you so much for making time. It's the end of the summer and you've got family and great things to do, but we're really lucky to have you. You're a personal hero of mine. Your devotion to country, your relentless optimism, and the fact that you and I may be the last two who see politics not as a blood sport against enemies, but rather, working with people who maybe don't see the same solutions as we do to try to make the country better. It's this book, which we will send a link after this to everybody who's interested and get you copies. We bought a bunch and we're eager to share them. It's a great read and it's a huge dose of optimism. So thank you for joining us.
Okay. I should have you out in front of me every day.
Well, I need better jokes if I'm going to be a front man, but let's start with the title is Hearts Touched with Fire. And you explained it within the book, but it's not self-evident. So maybe you'd explain where the title comes from and why you decided to write it now.
Sure. Well, one of the heroes of the 19th century, early 20th century, was a fellow named Oliver Holmes. His father was a prominent doctor in Boston, and through much of the 19th century, very, very well-to-do family. And when Lincoln issued his first call for volunteers in the Civil War, it was, if you had money, as Holmes did, it was easy to duck. You could buy your way out. That's what Teddy Roosevelt's father did, and Roosevelt always felt humbled by that, or at least unhappy about that. But in any event, so Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. could well have said, "I'm out of here," but instead he volunteered. He was a student at Harvard. He was like 21 years old. He joined right up as a volunteer, went off to war, and was grievously injured 3 times in the war. Different battlefields. In the last battlefield, he was left for dead. He was in such bad shape. Miraculously recovered, went on to survive the war, became a Supreme Court justice, appointed by Teddy Roosevelt, lasted till Franklin Roosevelt. Very, very well respected justice. But 20 years after the Civil War ended, Holmes gave a talk on Memorial Day. And he wanted to tell people what it was like to be a part of the Civil War on the battlefield as he was, and how it affected him. And he said, basically, it was to their great fortune that he was sent to war, that he thought it was an important thing for his generation, that he thought the real test of a manhood is whether you stood up to the tough calls that come, and whether you're prepared to do that. And the person who volunteers to do that was very special in his book. In any event, he went on to say, we were fortunate in our generation. Our hearts were touched by fire. Our hearts were touched by fire. I always love that quote because I think that it speaks to the one element of leadership, and that is if you have moral purpose, if you're doing something that's noble, as Holmes thought he was doing, then you can be very inspired by it. You can be inspired by your own story, by your own narrative. And that's where greatness comes. And so in writing a book about for these new generations, the rising generations, I wanted to recall some of the stories of people in the past whom I think are worth remembering, as Holmes was, but especially to remind people that when you're young and you do something noble, it can mark you for the rest of your life. It can give you a sense of, I've done something really important, and I'm going to continue doing something really important. If I can, I'm going to be as try to give back as much as I'm given. And that was very true of Holmes and his generation, and it's been true of successive generations, if I may say so, Bruce. When I first came to Washington, late 60s, early 70s, I was in a naval uniform. I'd been in for a tour of 3.5 years, and I was assigned to come in and try to help reform the draft with a small group of other military folks. But at any event, the World War II generation, the warriors of World War II, were ruling the country. They were running the country. Stick with me here. Somebody's trying to get in. We stick it out rather than giving it up. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, no, hear you great.
Okay, you're not bothered. There's a phone call trying to come in. Well, let's forget it and move.
Yeah, no,
okay,
ignore it. That sound doesn't come through, which is great.
So the point of all of this is this. Um, we had 7 presidents, starting with John F. Kennedy, after World War II, whom we call our World War II presidents, ones who came of age during the war. And we had 7 presidents from Kennedy through George Bush Sr. All 7 wore a military uniform during World War II, with the exception of Jimmy Carter, who was still in the Naval Academy when the war ended, and he went on to serve honorably. Those 7 presidents were a remarkable group, but they also governed in ways that we've tend to have forgotten. You know, they were respectful of each other. They had all fought under the same flag. They had done the big things together. And so when they came home, you know, after saving the world, they peeled off their military uniforms, and a lot of them, you know, went to work here in America on domestic issues, and many of them ran for office. And when I came to Washington, about 75% of the people who were serving in the House of Representatives were military veterans. 75%. We're down to about 15% now. And what I'm suggesting to you is it makes a big difference to the quality of our governance, because people who have, you know, now I think the world of the people coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. And, you know, I've been trying to encourage a lot of them to run for office, and many other people are encouraging them. And I'm really, it's one of the things I'm encouraged about in terms of where we're going as a country, that we still have veterans coming back who want to get into Congress. They want to change things. This is unacceptable what we're doing. And they just have a higher self-regard. You know, they're not into the poisonous, awful qualities we have with each other today. So yes, they made me optimistic. And the fact that we still have people coming back from military service wanting to serve their country back here domestically, that gives me hope for the long term. Not immediately. It's going to take a while. You know, Generation X, we ought to be worried about in the next few years, making sure that they have positions of real authority, because they've been left out too often. But down the road, for the long haul, it's the millennials and the Z generation. We had the first Z member going to Congress. Now he's got a 25-year-old young man who's running that apparently has a pretty good chance.
Well, first, as a Gen Xer, thank you for making sure we're not ignored. I was worried we were going to suffer the fate of the silence.
I didn't realize you're a Gen Xer. Terrific. You're perfect.
So let me ask you this. So I enjoyed it. Your optimism shows through when you talk about the people who served in uniform and the younger folks. A lot of this is a wonderfully crisp, greatest hits of second half of the 20th century leaders. You got Reagan, both Roosevelts, who admittedly are the first half of the 20th century, Churchill, right. Rosa Parks, John Lewis, RBG, AOC, a lot of folks that you do a great job in a very concise way telling the story of. But I'm wondering, what did you learn? Because a lot of this stuff, I feel like I knew a lot of, if not all of, and I'm interested the combination of, as you wrote this, you probably learned some things even you didn't know, despite having been on the front lines like you have for several decades. And then also, what really inspired you, again, that you didn't already know? So, you know, FDR is extraordinary, but you can't count.
Yeah. One of the, you know, there's no question that there was some named people, but what I did learn a lot about, which I hadn't fully appreciated, was the role that crucibles play in the lives of rising leaders. Crucibles we think of as moments that are really devastatingly difficult, that things sweep in and you're sort of knocked off your feet and often knocked out. And there are no better examples than Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. You know, Franklin Roosevelt, you know, the polio just knocked him for 6. And you know, he wanted to run for office again, but the language of politics is all about running. He couldn't walk. And so it was a major undertaking, but he tried for 7 years to learn how to walk, couldn't do it. And it was one example of the kind of crucible moment that I'm talking about. But in a similar way, if I might talk about Kay Graham, whom I had the pleasure of knowing, the privilege of knowing when she was at the Washington Post. And, you know, she went through a devastating period in her life when her husband, who was bipolar, and used to had these huge mood swings. He very bright named Phil. He was extremely bright, but he could be really mean. and unforgiving in his times when his spirit went the other way. But in any event, he was institutionalized, and he'd been there for a shortish while when he persuaded the person running, the manager of the institution, that he wanted to go home for a weekend with Kay in their farm outside in the Virginia mountains. And he was granted that, and he went off with Kay. And that Saturday then of that weekend, they both were up taking a nap upstairs. He got out of bed, went downstairs, and the next thing she knew, she heard this terrible shot. Just went downstairs. He shot himself with a shotgun. And it was like, here's a woman with 5 children who was a homemaker, and that's what she inherited. Well, so we have two different people, both went through crucibles, and the point is that crucibles tend to really call out for people: how resilient are you? How can you take it or not? And there's been some research done by a positive psychologist at I think at University of Pennsylvania, who found that he studied people who've been hit by crucibles, and what he found was that some never recovered. There was a group of people who never recovered, but there was a second group of people who within a year were back to where they had been before they went down, because of their resilience. But there was still a third group of people who not only were resilient and got back on their feet, but they were transformed by the experience, and they came out with a great sense of moral purpose in their lives. And these are the people you really look to realize, what they can bring to the table, because they're, say Reagan. And I think Reagan honestly believed this after he was shot by John Hinckley. I remember him saying, I was so fortunate that bullet came within an inch of his heart. And he said, I was so fortunate to escape alive that I'm going to devote the rest of my years to God. And that's going to be the basis on which I judge my politics. And I think he, to a serious extent, lived up to that. But I do think the research and also the experience is, which I hadn't fully appreciated yet, how people who suffer so much can actually aspire so high. I really appreciated those stories.
So let me ask you something about your story, which you didn't. A lot of this you talk about your own experiences was useful, but one of the most interesting things I think in your bio is having served Republican presidents Nixon, Ford, and Reagan. You get a call from President-elect Clinton, and you agree to go serve. And I'm interested. I know you got some flack from the more shirts and skins type partisan warriors.
Yeah.
What went into your decision to do that? Did you ever regret it?
Well, if you'd like to see the scars on my back, I'll show them to you sometime. There were moments of regret, but by and large, I'm really glad I did it. Listen, for starters, I knew him, and we had known each other for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, but we had become friendly. And when he was first thinking about running, let's say the day he declared that he was going to run, he called me that night to talk about, the fact he didn't think he was going to run, but he felt the call to it, and here's what he was going to do, and that sort of thing. And it was really interesting. So I had I'm a traditionalist, and I think if the president of the United States calls you and says, "Hey, I'm in trouble. I need help. Can you help me?" You should do it. The only question you should ask is, "When do I report?" Were there people who wanted to pull me down? Yeah, there were. And frankly, I didn't really blame them. The younger people in the White House, in the Clinton White House, had worked their tails off to beat the Republicans. And here their president gets elected, and one of the first things he does when he's in trouble, he calls this guy, Gergen, who worked for 3 Republicans, and he installs him in our White House in a position of some authority. There were people who pissed off. And they felt it was like inappropriate to do. It was a big surprise. He wanted the surprise element of it, and he got it. It was my surprise too. I mean, I had not expected it. But I'm glad I did it because, in part, because I began to realize, the people that serve in White Houses, many of them feel a special responsibility. They do want to see the president succeed. They want to see the nation succeed. And frequently when, they're discussed in the press, it's all about who's up, who's down. And if you're down, you get a lot of attention. If you're up, people try to dismiss you. I felt that there was really good people working for Clinton. I think he was a better president than he's given credit for today, with the Me Too movement and everything else. He's been, he's lost some stature, but the presidential reputations, as we've learned from historians like Arthur Schlesinger, they tend to go, the pendulum tends to go back and forth. I mean, Jefferson, for a very long, long time, everyone put up on a pedestal, and now he's fallen off the pedestal, and that bust is smashed. And he's, a lot of historians even have jumped on him. So, and Clinton's going through some of that right now. But it gave me a chance to sort of see the other side and come out of it with the belief that, there are really good people. So there are some really good people on both sides of the aisle in politics. And the question becomes, can they find each other, and can they build a coalition within that can help? And I have to say, I think a lot of these military veterans, for example, can do that. But I've also, to show you how far my pendulum swung the other way, when I have a lot of regard for AOC and the progressives in the Democratic Party. Their politics are way to the left of mine. But I celebrate to this day the fact that the AOCs of the world are getting into the arena. We need them in there. We're not going to solve these problems with one group of people. It's going to have to be a broad-based coalition of people who are not like each other to get out of this mess. And I think we should be somewhat humble about who serves the country best. I can well remember back in the 60s and 70s how much grumbling there was on both sides of the aisle about all these crazy people are out in the streets. And what do they mean? They're down there. Kennedy tried to get Martin Luther King to call off the marches in order to call off what he was doing, because he thought it would hurt us in the eyes of the world. And what we've learned is that those people who were in the streets against the war in Vietnam and against Watergate, they were right. And so what if they had more radical views? In the end, they turned out to be right. And we shouldn't be so high and mighty to think what we think now is, the only way to think about something. It's simply not true.
So let me ask you this then, as a traditionalist, do you think had President Trump called you in January of 2017 and said, I could use somebody who's done a lot of this before, would you have served? And if he somehow comes back in 2025, would you join a Trump administration?
No. If he asked me, can you come in and talk to me? I'd do that. If he asked me, but I would have to see some evidence of change, and real sort of come to Jesus kind of moment before I would do that. But and I think we should try to. When President Obama he got clipped in the first by-election, midterm elections, he called me and asked me to come over. And I came over and spent an hour and a half with him, and I gave my best shot, and he seemed to be responding very well. I never thought it lasted very long, but he was kind enough to do that. And so, sure, I want to see. Listen, it's a fairly small fraternity of people who've actually had the privilege of working in the White House. But I do think, as a general proposition, most of the people who belong to that fraternity really do care about the success of whoever's in that office. And I want our presidents to succeed. It's the most powerful office in the world. But one of the reasons I wouldn't go to work for Trump is I think he wants to destroy the moral authority of the office.
So let me ask you this. You, like I am, a history major. I wish there were more of us. And you make a great case.
Princeton and UVA, you can't get more historian. I want you to know that I just went out with James McPherson to walk the battlefields of Gettysburg. I know it's something a few people at Princeton do every year, and it was wonderful.
I took Professor McPherson's class within a year or two of his writing Battle Cry of Freedom. So yeah, I know
Yeah.
the tour, and I know Professor McPherson's class. I never got that close. But let me ask you this. So as history guys, it feels really fraught and divisive today, except for me, what I find solace in is go back and read, the 60s, the 70s, the bitter fights about
Yeah.
Vietnam, civil rights, Reagan's foreign policy,
Yeah.
Nixon's behavior, Clinton's behavior. And I'm interested, do you feel like indeed it's worse or it's just immediate today? I'm interested in how you
Yeah.
compare.
Yeah, well, one of the major historians of the early days of the Republic, um, had an insight which I found quite moving, and that was, he said, "Look, you have to understand in terms of judging the argumentative quality of politics, that there were fierce arguments during the early Republic. There were fierce rivalries during the early months of the Republic and the early years of the Republic. But they were carried out with the understanding, the belief that shared across the board was, we're going to fight like hell before we make a decision. But once we get ready to make a decision, we're in this together, and the decision we will accept the decision of the group." But it was very much that fights ought to end in compromises. And the whole question of where Washington D.C. was going to be, where the capital of the country was going to be, came out of a dinner, with Hamilton and Madison. Two or three guys sitting down and reaching a compromise. We'll put the capital in the South, as long as you leave a lot of space in the North, places like New York and elsewhere, that our mores have to be respected too. But it was a trade-off. And that makes a major difference. And I think that today, it's like we're permanent enemies. We're no longer rivals, we're enemies. And I think that has eroded trust in our institutions. It's eroded trust in our and our politicians, and it's made it much, much harder to govern. Much harder to govern. For first place, once you do something, the other side won't support you. There are no votes. And what you do, especially things you do by executive order, those don't last. You change administrations and the executive orders get canceled.
Yeah.
What kind of, that's not real politics.
So then, as a student of presidential leadership and history,
Yeah.
what president in American history would be best suited right now? Like what are the characteristics of a person who could somehow rise above that, bring us back together, short of a cauldron like the Great Depression, World War II, or a Civil War?
I have to confess, I've thought about that question, and I've had a really hard time coming up with the name of anybody who was in the current field of potential aspirants for 2024. I have not seen any Lincoln in their midst that who's been noticeable. But isn't it true that whenever we choose a president, we're taking sort of a risk. We're not sure, how the people we elect usually are the first time they go in the office. We've never seen them as president before, and that office can turn your head. You can go in a lot of unpredictable directions. So there is a bit of a chance taking there. There's a bit of a gamble, but I think that gamble is greatly, greatly enhanced and to pay off if there are coalitions of people who are willing to try to work with the new president. Then the new president has to have, I think, some restraint. If the new president simply goes for the moon, like we're gonna do the New Deal squared, there's no person on the Republican side who's ever going to vote for that. But if you put it into a place where it's closer to the center right, I actually think that Joe Manchin had the point. I think at the end of the day, the Democratic Party and its reforms are going to be stronger because of what Manchin was trying to do. And what we've seen now, as Larry Summers pointed out, everybody was aghast when he said, what we're doing here is this Democratic president. I'm a Democrat, as Summers would say, but I said we're going to have a lot of inflation if we go down this path. And here we are. We got that inflation. So, You know, I think it pays all of us to be more humble.
I agree. And an interesting reality of history, I think, is that the greatest presidents were all fairly underestimated before they took
Yes.
office. You talk about FDR, but
Yep.
even Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln's bio didn't indicate he was going to be as extraordinary as he
Right.
was. And, extraordinary
No,
times.
FDR. I mean, Lincoln was like a placeholder. I mean, he was thought he could be anything, and and Franklin Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt, they wanted to get him the hell out of New York. They wanted him to be president so he wouldn't be in Washington. That was his own party. So these, but I do think I don't know. One of the rules, the informal rules I have is I think trust is very very important, and I always look to see if you look at the friends or the people surrounding this presidential candidate, how long have they been friends? Have they been friends for 10 minutes since they became famous, or did their friendships go back 20 years? And I think people who can maintain friendships for 20 years and be honest with each other are people I tend to sort of go for. They're more reliable, they're more trustworthy in the office. And I think there's some old-fashioned ways we ought to be thinking about. I also think, frankly, the people in the smoke-filled rooms came up with better presidents than we did in the primary system.
Yeah, we had Catherine Gale on to talk about, I think, a very innovative approach to going away from partisan primaries into a final five. So the top five vote getters move forward. You're seeing something like that with ranked choice added in Alaska.
Right, yeah. Yep. Yeah. And ranked choice is running into some bumps along the road here. And people are pointing out, I was very interested in ranked choice, but I think we ought to give more time to experiment, because you are in a situation where if the person who gets the most votes then loses the election under ranked choice, you're going to have one hell of a row based on that. That person who lost is going to feel, wait a minute, this crazy system elected the wrong guy. So I just think we ought to, before we all rush to ranked choice, and there are a number of states, it's my friends in Minneapolis and St. Paul, they're very, very high on ranked choice. And there are other places in the Northeast that are high on ranked choice. So I do think it's a good experiment, but I also realize there are going to be some counter arguments.
Well, look, one of the great things about America and look at history of American reforms is often they start at state and local, and we see laboratories of experimentation, and then it gets worked out and figured out. That was true of high school. That was true of direct election of senators, et cetera. Let me ask you this. You wrote a book about leadership. Yesterday, we mourned the passing of Mikhail Gorbachev, who certainly was a great 20th century leader. For those who believe in what we believe. You must have run into him a lot. I'm interested in your take on him.
Well, I didn't see him on every street corner. I mean, but there was a time, if you were Reagan, wanted to meet and sit down with the head of the Soviet Union, but then they had a revolving door. People coming through the ranks over there, and there was nobody he could sit down with until Gorbachev came along. And even then, Reagan, I think very wisely, as you will recall, took the view that he could work with Gorbachev, but that it was his motto was trust but verify, trust but verify. That was, I think, a very wise approach. And when he went out, remember when he met Gorbachev on the ship, and it was raining like hell, and Gorbachev was trying to wanted them to get all American troops out of Europe and take all the tank and guns with them. And Reagan was thinking very seriously about that. Nancy was, for example, had for a long time been telling him he could be a great man of peace, and that's what she aspired to for him. And it came very close. There was, they came very close to a deal, and then Reagan, it got to the point where the Russians were asking too much, and he walked away from it. And I think did the right thing. Gorbachev, to me, is a it's a tragic story, because he was a reformer. He did want to keep the Soviet system in place. He wanted to keep the empire in place, but he very much wanted to modernize. And he was trying to. I think he was trying to do some things that, had they worked out, could have saved us a lot. As it was, he gets a lot of credit for ending the Cold War, And he gets a lot of credit for being the person who did it. I personally think Reagan deserves more credit than he gets, that he should be shared with Gorbachev. Yes, Gorbachev was a prime mover, but Reagan was a person who was trying to make something work. And the Star Wars that he proposed, the Strategic Defense Initiative, as it's called, it was the anti-missile system that Reagan proposed. I was there when we proposed that, and he shocked us when he wanted to go on TV with that proposal, because it had not been widely cleared inside the administration, and it was very radical. But it was in the end of the day, I think Gorbachev certainly made this pretty clear, that Star Wars was something that the Soviets simply did not have the capacity to build. And they were already spending tons and tons of money on their military, and it was going to require a huge investment to catch up to the United States. And I think basically Gorbachev sued for peace. He realized that Star Wars was sort of the final blow. He knew he couldn't build it. The United States innovation turned out to be a major, major plus for us. And the Cold War ended, without any more shots being fired. So that was good news. So, but it's also true that, and it's interesting how Bruce, about how you see this. I saw this with Margaret Thatcher. Saw it with John Major in England. Margaret Thatcher, in the end of the day, was much more popular in the U.S. political circles than she was in British political circles. That was true too of some other British politicians. But it was also now true. It was true of Gorbachev, that he's much more popular in the West. He's much more popular among historians than he is in Russia, where they were still starving. Even as he was going about his international diplomacy, they were starving. And to this day, he's blamed for the breakup of the Soviet Union. Putin was generally pretty supportive in his statement, or at least he was at least being polite. But Putin thought he was a catastrophe. He thought the breakup of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe, and that Gorbachev was largely responsible for it. There was a widespread view that in making big transitions like that, you got to get your economics right, and you got to get your politics right. That Gorbachev got it wrong, screwed it up, when instead of trying to fix his politics first, he tried to fix the economy, and he didn't bring people along, and so the politics didn't work, and it fell apart. Contrast that with the Chinese. In China, the leadership started by trying to change the politics. Once they had a sufficient support, and they also had their authoritarian rule everywhere, they could then go with the economics. And it turned out it was the right move to go.
So let me ask you back on another David Gergen question. You've had lots of cool jobs, from the Navy to multiple White Houses, the academia, and the Center for Public Leadership at Kennedy School, and the speaking circuit. Which of the long list, which was your favorite and why?
Well, my favorite person working for directly was Jim Baker, who was Reagan's chief of staff, and I thought the best chief of staff ever in the White House. So I really appreciated that. But if you want to know what was most meaningful to me, it was not Washington, D.C. It's a privilege to work in Washington, and for any president. And since I work for four of them on both sides of the aisle, I feel particularly privileged. But what really moved me, and has moved me for a number of years, was my work much earlier back home in my home state of North Carolina. I come from the South. You went to basically what we call Southern schools. And that there's a certain sense of honor there. There's a tradition in the South that if there's a call, whether it's for stars and bars, it doesn't make a difference. When you're called, you try to go, and that's partly what moved me to go. But I was enlisted. I enrolled with a new governor in the state named Terry Sanford. He was our John F. Kennedy. He was Democrat, charismatic, very progressive, well educated, and that jumped in the Battle of the Bulge. Now let's say he went in D-Day +2 or 3. He was in. He was just a terrific human being. He turned out to be became senator, president of Duke University. He did a lot of wonderful things in life. But when he was governor, he felt called upon to deal with civil rights cases. That was the early '60s when civil rights was boiling up. And I went to work for. I was a summer intern and then stayed for 3 summers working on civil rights for Terry. And he had a man named David Coltrane who was running something called the North Carolina Good Neighbor Council for him. David Coltrane was a staunch old segregationist who had a conversion and became a big civil rights activist. And I went to work for David Coltrane, and I was his driver. I was his communications director. I was his policy director. I was his personal advisor. I was his friend. David was sort of a one-man show, and we had a wonderful time. But what I remember about it so clearly are 2 things. One was how satisfying it was to work with David and go from community to community to set up good neighbor councils to bring leading white citizens together with leading Black citizens to work together on public education and on getting jobs for kids. And by the way, to keep the peace, to keep the racial peace. That was the time, '63, when those 3 white guys from the Northeast went to Mississippi and were tortured and killed. And an awful moment. So there was danger in the air, but it was just so satisfying to be able to actually work face to face with somebody and see change taking place and see hope entering into the conversation. We got through the civil rights period in a pretty darn good way, and North Carolina turned out to be a more progressive state than almost all the other southern states. But I remember how, and I tell people, the young people today, if you want to go really make a difference in politics, you can look at in Washington. If there's a very special job there for you, you should take that. But if you don't have a very special job, go to work in the local estate. Work in the city, work in your state, because that's where the action is these days. And you can make more of a difference there. Now, I must tell you, there were moments when I was not so sure about that. In particular, I remember vividly in the summer, I had a good friend from high school who was a pastor of a Black church, and my friend was white, but he was in a Black church, and he and I talked about the fact that there was a KKK rally coming up. North Carolina had a big KKK element. And we decided we were going to go, and none of us had ever been to a rally, and he wanted to tape it for his parishioners back home, and which was fine from my point of view. But we went to this it was out in the boonies, and it was this great big huge field where we came in, and there were cops all around. But as soon as we got onto the field itself, the cops disappeared, and what we saw were people in brown shirts, big burly guys who were KKKers, who were coming after us and hassling us. Even as they lit the fires and everything else, they took the tape recorder, they stole the tape recorder. But very importantly, as we were getting ready to leave when it was over, we went down to our car, which was surrounded by at least 300 people who were there waiting for us. And they started yelling epithets at us, and they said, we're going to teach you never to come here again. We're going to show you who's the boss around here and so forth. So we barely got into our car. We were sitting there, and I was riding shotgun. And I turned to the guy who was my friend and said, we got no choice. They're dancing on the top of this car. They're going to try to kill us. And we got to get the hell out of here. So please turn on the ignition, and please start driving very slowly. Don't run over anybody, but start driving very slowly, and let's see if we can get out. And people started parting away, but then they jumped in their cars and they chased us. We went down a highway for 10 or 15 minutes. And they were trying to get us. And so I felt we were, the honest answer is I thought it was reckless in retrospect to have gone there. We shouldn't, I should have done that because we touched off something. You don't want to be in this situation, looking like you're coming in, you're looking at monkeys in a zoo. Who are these people? I want to come and see them as monkeys in a zoo. It's disrespectful, and it then gets them off. And so you have to be. I think we need to be more sensitive than I sometimes have been. But in any event, I'm really proud that I had an opportunity to work in civil rights. It was sort of the great moral cause of our time when I was young. One of the reasons going to work for Clinton was I think there are times in life that you can perhaps make a difference, and you ought to seize those moments. And you can often pay a price. You can pay a reputational price. You can lose your friends. You can get beat up pretty easily. But I just think there are not many moments in politics when you can really feel, hey, I made a difference here.
So last two questions. If you were 20 years old, 21, you were choosing your major in college and thinking about what you'd do next, what do you think you'd do? And I promise for multiple family members, I'm not asking for 3 20-something-year-olds named Mehlman who are figuring it out too.
Well, first of all, I think you ought to be bold. I think you ought to try. I think you ought to take stretch jobs, jobs that you're not quite sure you're good enough or you haven't had the experience, but you're still going to give it a crack. But you ought to take jobs that really do move you. I think it's easier to decide what you don't want to do in life than it is to decide what you do want to do. I think it's smart to have a variety of different jobs when you're young. I do think it's important to work. I think it's important to learn how to earn a dollar, because most of mankind has had to do that, and there are too many of us who've been, come out of the elites, who've never been really put to the test. It's one of the reasons I'm on a hobby horse about this. I really national service that encourages every young American between 18 and 24 to give a year back, especially in your own community if you can. You work in your high school or your schools, K-12, work in a hospital, work in a jail. There are a lot of different things you can do. Work on climate change, be a first responder when fires and when you can help out with things like that. And the Civilian Conservation Corps, you'll remember as a historian, the old CCC that Franklin Roosevelt created and put 250,000 people and young men into the parks and forests of America, cleaning them up and restoring them and paying them $1 a day. It was one of the most successful programs and certainly one of the most popular programs of the New Deal. And it put together people who didn't know each other, and it really makes a difference. One of the things that made it happen in the war, if you get somebody like a Saltonstall from Massachusetts, the creme de la creme, saluting some Polish guy from Brooklyn, that's progress in terms of our race relations and our, creating a just society. And we need more of that. And I think giving a year back to your country, if you do that, I think you ought to take a year off your tuition. I don't think I am really wary of this whole idea of let's just throw money at people to pay off their tuition. I think we'd be far better off if we ask them to do something in exchange for it. I'm all for getting their debt down, but I think if they skin in the game, if they felt that they had earned it, all of us would be prouder.
So I was going to ask you as a last question, what sort of, what reforms do you think would help improve things? Though I think the right answer, and the answer that General Stanley McChrystal gave, is what you just said, which is a year of service really does bring people from various walks of life all together and helps them invest.
Stan McChrystal has been right out on the point for the last several years. He's been terrific. He worked out of a group out of Aspen on this. There are other people, Jeff Koons, Senator Koons, who's very close to Joe Biden. Koons is a big national service guy. And there are, if you look around, you find a number of national service people now. I have some conservatives who are on my tail about it. They say, oh, no. What they forget, Bill Buckley, the sainted Bill Buckley of the conservative class, he was not only for national service, he was for compulsory national service, that you should be compelled to do this. I'm not sure McChrystal's willing to go there quite yet, but I do think he obviously, and I believe very strongly, this country would be better off if we were asking more of each other. And service is, I wouldn't do national service in the military. I think that's not good for the military. But we pay a lot of homage these days, and I think rightly so, to people who are coming back from having served in a military uniform. I would like to see a program for civilian service that brings that same sense of honor, and it brings the same sense of I'm here for my country. That I think would really would solve so many of the problems we have in politics.
I share your hope and your optimism, and belief in that is a great solution. David, you've been unbelievably generous. You have just hours of August remaining. It's a great book. I'm going to send a link to everybody here. We're happy to just send you a copy. You just need to enter your address so that we don't have to do the mailing, that somebody else will do it.
I should bring more to those Mehlman children.
We're getting copies for them too. But thank you for being so generous with your time. Thanks for sharing your thoughts both here and in the book.
Thank you. Being patient.
Of course.